right, hello, welcome on behalf of our series partner organizations, which I'd like to credit: Phoenixville Communities That Care, Phoenixville Recreation Department, Phoenixville Area Transition Living Landscape, Penn State Extension, Camphill Kimberton Hills, Phoenixville Hospital, Trellis for Tomorrow, and the Chester County Food Bank.
Wow.
My name is Mark Pinto. Yes, impressive collaboration we have here. I'd like to welcome you to Phoenixville Public Library and tonight's presentation in the Community Gardening Around the Village series, which is, gosh, more than about a year and a half strong now. We've been doing this. This is our first, well, no, second live and in-person program in the series. And tonight we're pleased to have with us Sherry Wildfeuer, editor of Stella Natura, a biodynamic planting calendar. She's also an employee of Camphill Village Kimberton Hills, a 420-acre biodynamic farming and crafting community for adults with special needs. Tonight she'll answer the questions: what does it mean to plant by the moon? And why might you want to try it? So please welcome Sherry Wildfeuer.
So, I've given calendar workshops many times, but never in 55 minutes. So it's kind of a race to get something across that's whole and meaningful. But on the other hand, I also want to answer your questions. So be bold and interrupt me at any point when it feels like you didn't get it or you need to know something more. Because I sometimes forget to say the right thing. Yes.
Like this?
Yes. So, thank you for inviting me to speak about Stella Natura. This is the 45th edition that I put out.
Wow. Nice.
So I started doing this when I had no gray hair. I was in my early 30s. And even though I grew up on Long Island, I think I qualify as a local. Because I've been in Kimberton Hills for 48 years. And you all know what Kimberton Hills is, so I don't have to describe it in detail. But I do want to acknowledge that aside from all the things we do, which is quite a variety of things, the whole impulse was inspired by the work of Rudolf Steiner. So that really gives it its character and, yeah, its thrust. And just so, I always put on the back cover all the different things about Kimberton Hills. I don't think I put all the things that, there's such a wide range of contributions that Rudolf Steiner made. I just wanted to say them out in the beginning. I was thinking as I was driving here, we've got Cara Medical Arts on Gay Street, so there's anthroposophical medicine. Anthroposophical architecture, and I'm going to, at a certain moment soon, I'm going to pass around a couple of books, not for you to get absorbed in them, but just to get a picture of a building that Rudolf Steiner architected. Waldorf education, we have the Kimberton Waldorf School, our area. Biodynamics, the art of eurythmy, and I want to say that because we're going to have two fabulous eurythmy performances in May and June, and so that's something that I'm hoping people will come to in Rose Hall. Let's see. Of course, Camphill, communities with special children and adults with special needs. So, but I learned about this calendar work even before I moved to Kimberton Hills. I learned about it in my, hello, welcome. I learned about the calendar work when I was in my early 20s, because I was very interested in learning about biodynamic agriculture, and I had done what I could in America, so I went off to Switzerland thinking I'd go to the headquarters of the anthroposophical movement, and that's called the Goetheanum. That's an amazing book. These are all in German, but it's worthwhile just to take a peek at the images of this building. I got to work there. Well, not in the building, but outside in the gardens. And one of the jobs that I did was to replicate an experiment in the garden by the original experimenter was a woman named Maria Thun. She was a German biodynamic farmer. So I'm going to describe this experiment, but first I'm going to do a little lesson in basic astronomy. Because if you are like me, the last time you studied astronomy was probably 8th grade. That's the last time I did. And do I remember everything that... And mostly it wasn't so, not only not memorable, it was pretty abstract. So mostly what I remember is a heliocentric view, you know, that everything goes around the sun. But we're thinking about plants, and they are geocentric. In other words, their center is the earth. That's where their roots go down into, and they reach up to the sun, but to everything else as well. So the astronomy, and it's a legitimate point of view in astronomy, is geocentrism. So that's what I'm going to be describing to you. So you'll have to kind of, in a quick way, unlearn the things that you know in order to get oriented to what's actually out there and what you can see. There's so many things we'll get to. So the first thing is that when you look out at the sky and you see stars, I'm going to call them the fixed stars. That means they're fixed in their relations to one another. They don't like walk around. They're always in the same constellations. They're always next to the constellation that they're next to, and the whole sky turns together. I once had the experience of the dome of the heavens. I finally had learned every constellation I could see, and so wherever I looked, I knew what I was looking at, and just that one night, it all held together. And it was so amazing. I really understood something deep because I knew wherever I looked, it was like a seamless robe. And I experienced the dome, so it's there. And that's the fixed stars. And they rise on a daily basis in the east and set in the west. So there's this giant motion that's going from east to west. Among those fixed stars, there are the wandering stars, or the planets. And we never learned this in 8th grade. I don't believe you did. Tell me if I'm wrong, and your teacher clued you in. They move from west to east among the fixed stars, against the background of the fixed stars. Did anybody know that? That is like you did. Good. But it's like basic human knowledge, and nobody taught us. So that's important. And in this sense, the sun and the moon are planets. They're wandering stars because they move along this band. The path of the sun, the path of the sun is a plane. It's an orbit, but you can create a plane out of that orbit, and that is called the plane of the ecliptic. And there's a band of 12 constellations along the ecliptic, and that's the zodiac. So the zodiac is formed, I mean, it's among the fixed stars, but the thing that gives it its character is that it's the path of the sun. But it's also the path of the moon and all the other planets. So they're also going, but at very different speeds. Some of them are zipping around like the moon every month. The sun takes a whole year to go around. And Saturn takes 29 years. Pluto takes, I mean, we're really only gonna deal with the visible planets. So this is not an astrology thing, this is actually visible astronomy. Let's see what so there are 3 different ways of looking at the zodiac, just to keep things complicated. The one that I use in making the calendar is the unequal constellations. So when you see a picture of Leo, it's got a head and a body and a tail, right? I don't cut it off at some point. The picture has an integrity, it's an image. And each of the zodiac constellations is an image. Some of them are very large, and some of them are quite small. And so they're unequal. It's hard to determine what's the actual boundary between constellations, because sometimes there's a gap where there's nothing, there are no notable stars, and sometimes they actually overlap, which makes it very confusing. But I have a connection to the person who did the data for me, the computer data, is in Italy. He's Italian, and he studied Ptolemy in the original Latin and learned the names of the stars, and so I go by his definition. It's very, I mean, it's within a couple of degrees of it's called the United Association of Astronomy or something like that. So it's all very, very close, but anyway, I thought if I happen to know somebody who's so knowledgeable, I might as well use his wisdom. So, so we use the unequal constellations that are visible to us as pictures. You can also divide that circle into 12 30-degree pie slices. And that's the sidereal zodiac. That's a geometrical way of doing it, but that cuts the pictures up grossly from my feeling. I just can't do it. And Maria Toon worked with the unequal. She tried experimenting with plants with both ways of doing it and found the unequal pictures to be actually like current events. The third way is the way that you see in popular astrology, like the newspaper. So everybody knows what sign they are, and that's the tropical. And that's not what you can see in the sky, in fact. That's a whole constellation off because of something called the precession of the equinox. So every 72 years, when the sun rises at the spring equinox, the stars in the background are 1 degree different from what they were 72 years before. So there's this gradual precession actually going that way. of the equinox, and the tropical just ignores that and says that at the spring equinox, it's 0 degrees Aries. But in fact, at the spring equinox, the stars of Pisces are behind the sunrise. So it's a whole constellation off.
So is another way of saying that the plane of the equator going out into the stars is one?
No, this is
plane.
the ecliptic, not
and then
the equator.
ecliptic is moving along that the intersection of the ecliptic with the equator, with the plane of the equator, is where the equinoxes are, right? Where the sun crosses that equator again, and then that is, so the ecliptic is moving, you know?
No, that's the nodes, what you're thinking. We'll get to the nodes. But this is actually just the speed of the sun is slowly a little less and gradually moving backwards through the zodiac. So anyway, that's just to let you know that when you look at the calendar, the first thing people say is, oh, you made a mistake, you know, and I do sometimes make a mistake. It's horrible, but I didn't make that mistake. So they look quickly for their birthday, and then they see, oh, the sun is in the wrong constellation, and so I must have made a mistake. So that's, yeah.
When did the 72 years start? You say every 72 years.
It's just an ongoing process. I don't think there's at the time of Christ, the two were coincident. That's when they started recording where the constellations, the planets were in the constellations. And so that time, it was 0 degrees Aries behind the sunrise at the spring equinox. I don't want to take too much time on this because we have so much to do, but just to say that since that time, it's moved a whole constellation. Okay, so I need to add one element of astronomy, which is basic common knowledge, and that is that these signs of the zodiac, or the constellations of the zodiac, each have a relation to one of the 4 elements. So if you know what your birth sign is, you basically know, oh yeah, I'm an earth sign, or I'm a fire sign, or something. Is that correct? Everybody kind of knows that. You don't?
I don't know.
No.
I'm right on the line between Libra and Virgo.
So Virgo is an earth
Okay.
constellation, and Libra is air.
What is Aries? Aries
Aries
must be
is
air.
fire.
Oh, okay, fire.
Yeah. So in the key of the calendar, it says which each constellation is. So it gives the symbol, the Latin name, the English name, the region, the degrees, and the element. Just be thorough. And then one other thing I wanted to use this for is that just from plant observation, I want us to know, I'm not going to use a lot of different colors. I get into it, but not tonight. So if here's the earth, and there's a seed, and it's gonna first send out a little root, and more roots, and more roots. And then it's gonna send up a little cotyledon, and then it's gonna send out some more leaves. This is very generic. And more leaves, and then whoop, a stem, and then a flower. And there's gonna be magic in the middle of the flower, and out of that is going to become a seed that will fall out. So if we had to find a relation of this plant to the 4 elements, what would you say would be here?
Water.
So that's earth in relation to the roots. And then we have all this leafy growth,
Water.
water. It's also light, but we're gonna go with water here. All that vegetative growth is watery. Then we have the flower. It's fragrant, it's colorful.
Air.
Yes. And then in that magic part in the middle of the flower, over time there ripens the seed, the seeds. And that's okay. So we have the 4 elements that are spread out in the sky, in the constellations of the zodiac, and we have them in the plants. So now I prepared you for the experiment. So Maria Toon was a biodynamic farmer, and she took seriously something that Rudolf Steiner said in the whole of biodynamics comes out of 8 lectures called the agriculture course. That's all we have to build the whole of biodynamics from. But they're luckily so concentrated and potent that you keep studying them. I have a friend who's re-annotating it. He spends years, his whole life. Somebody once asked him in my presence, is there ever a day that you don't work on the agriculture course? He said, no. It's amazing. So, in that first lecture, Rudolf Steiner said that everything on earth is but a reflection of what is taking place in the cosmos. So there's a correspondence between what happens in the sky and what happens on earth. As above, so below. This is also ancient wisdom. But he then goes on to say that well, he talks about the loss of nutrition and taste in the food, even from his childhood. So he gave these lectures when he was in his 60s. And he was saying that he can't find potatoes that taste like the ones that he grew up with, even in the areas where he grew up. So he said there's a loss of nutritive value, and that a lot has to do with the disconnect between the farming practices and the cosmos. And he just threw it out to the people, and he said, it would be important to make a science of this. Somebody should take it up. And she did. So her method was to sow radishes every day and to watch them develop and record what she observed. So radishes are like the mice of plant experiments because they grow so fast. And they go to the full cycle in one season. So radishes will go all the way up to flower and seed in one season, part of the season. So that's what makes them great for experiments. So she noticed that every few days there was a kind of a cluster of certain characteristics, and then it would shift. but she didn't know what the correspondence was in the sky. She didn't know what that was. But she did see that, and she, like I said, wrote everything down, when it was sown, and so radishes also have these interesting variations. If you've grown radishes, sometimes they're sweet, sometimes they're really sharp or bitter, sometimes they're super leafy and you get these puny radishes. Other times you get gorgeous big radishes and not too much leaf. Sometimes they go bolting quickly up to seed for no reason that you can figure out. I mean, so they have all this variety, and in fact, all plants have that variety, but these are just so obvious. So she noticed that they had these characteristics every few days, but she just didn't know what it meant. And then she went to a lecture at the Goetheanum, which you have all those books somewhere, and the speaker was telling about the relation of the zodiac to the 4 elements. And so she thought, oh, maybe it has to do with the passage of the moon through the zodiac. And because she had all her data recorded, she went back and saw that there was a correspondence between the sowing time of the radishes and the characteristics that corresponded, so that the earth ones had the bigger roots. The watery one, the water signs, had more leaf growth, which is not thrilling if you're growing radishes. I make good pesto out of radish tops, by the way, but I don't grow it for that. Then, because I have to do something with all this radish material because I keep making experiments. So, air is when it tends to go up to flower, who you're definitely not excited about that. And fire is also going up to seed. So those were the characteristics that she observed. And once she got the key, she started making more experiments and really confirmed it. And then she got excited and made a calendar, a planting calendar, and about 50% of the biodynamic, I'm going to turn this upside down because I think maybe one side is stretched out. I've already had COVID. Anyway, about half of the biodynamic movement was very enthusiastic about her planting calendar and really confirmed. So, people don't only grow radishes. I don't know if you've had these experiences, you've grown a lot of vegetables. So my experience was that I've grown fabulous beds of peppers, for example, completely bushy, healthy, thriving plants with hardly any peppers, and they just didn't ripen. It was so irritating. They were fabulously healthy, but who knew why they weren't doing their thing right? You know, where other times you can grow peppers, they're not especially great looking plants, but they're loaded with bright red peppers. So each plant that we grow, we want it to be healthy, but sorry, it wasn't salt. But each of us want the roots of the carrot as opposed to a lot of carrot tops, and you can fill out the rest. So it really matters where the emphasis is in the growth of the plant. And since the moon is just moving along every few days into a new constellation, that was the missing link. So now, that's just when I came to the Goetheanum. So in the early 1970s, I go there and I say, I want to learn about biodynamics. And
This just then being Maria Thun?
Thun, T-H-U-N.
Okay. She had just finished these experiments?
She had been doing those experiments for some years and put out a calendar, and the biodynamic movement was all excited about it, and the Goetheanum was like, we're not sure. So they wanted to replicate one of her experiments, and that's when I turned up, not speaking German, and being a know-nothing, but very enthusiastic, and so I did the work of the experiment. And they couldn't explain it to me because I wouldn't have understood them. But I knew what to do, but I didn't know like the theory behind it. So, now I'm going to show you what I did. So I had 4 plots, and each of these lines is a bed. And there were probably 5 things. I can't remember. I was in my early 20s and now I'm in my, I'm 74. So I don't remember exactly what was in each bed, but I remember what was in some beds. So I did the same exact thing in each of these. This was fruit, fire. This was leaf, water. This was flower. And this was fruit. And in each of these plots, I had this identical plants. So I know this one was calendula. I never have grown such great calendula as I did that year. I don't know why. I must have had great seeds or something. So you get the idea. That goes all along. And then there was something there, and I know this was beets. And this was carrots. Right? So, these, God knows what was in there. It must have been something like lettuce or string beans or I don't know. But that was the experiment. And every time the moon moved into a new constellation, I was out there. First, I dug all the beds. Then I sowed the seeds on those days. I cultivated. I did everything. And then as soon as they were old enough, I used the biodynamic preparations. I was stirring preparations every 2 or 3 days. I got really buff. So I couldn't tell any difference from one plot to the other. They all looked great. For me as a young beginning gardener, there wasn't really a lot that I could notice until the very end. Then I had to harvest. They asked me to harvest the roots first. And I went to the barn and I got a crate of one of those big wooden crates, like an orange crate, and put it in front of each of the plots so that I would then dig them up. And it just so happened that I started digging up here, and I filled the crate, and they were great. Then I did the same here. Was fine. Did the same here. I did the same here, but what shocked me was that every carrot I dug up was beautiful. And you know, when you're a gardener, when you find like the perfect carrot, you want to go around and show everybody because it's so aesthetic. I mean, it's like the form. Well, all of them are like that, and I filled the crate and I hadn't finished harvesting. So it was like, wait a minute. They must be bigger too, because I know that they're the same size. I did everything. So I went and I got a flat and I filled it up. And then I had to do the beets. And the same exact thing happened. That by the time I got to the root section, they were gorgeous. And I had to go back to the barn and get another flat because they didn't fit in the crate. So I'm just like, oh, I bet she's right. Something is going on here. Then a little while later, they gave me little brown paper bags and they told me to harvest the seeds of the calendula. Normally you don't grow calendula for the seeds, you grow them for the flowers. But anyway, that's what they wanted. And I happened to start on that end. So it was gross for me as a young person. It was the end of the season. There were these very substantial flowers that were kind of gooey, and I was supposed to pick out the seeds from the middle of the flower. It was not, they were kind of, it was gross. But I did it, and I did it, and I did it, and then I came to here, and I totally panicked. There's no seeds. What am I supposed to do? It's my job, right? I'm supposed to bring the seeds in. But they had all dried up and fallen down, and on the ground was a whole carpet of little baby calendula plants that had germinated. So obviously they had ripened quickly, while those were still in the gooey stage, and enough so that they could already germinate. So that just knocked my socks off. I just got so impressed that she was right. And weirdly enough, they never wrote this experiment up. Nobody ever asked me about it. So the only thing that happened that summer with this experiment was my whole life changed. It's weird, but I started, okay. I think now we should look at the charts. So if you would not bend them up or make them unsaleable, then you get borrow a calendar. You want one, Mark?
Yeah.
So let's look on February, since that's when it is. So I gave you such a long story because I wanted you to know that that's the signature aspect of the calendar. Now you understand why that is going to look like that. So you see these different columns. The first one is the date. That's pretty obvious. Then that circle with the dot in the middle is the sun in the zodiac. So up until the 7th, the sun was in Aquarius. And starting on the 8th at 14 o'clock, which is 2 o'clock, so it's a 24-hour system, the sun is in Pisces, the fishes. Can you see that? No. Okay. So, I'm looking at the wrong month, that's why. But you can see that it was in, thank you. the only smart one here. Okay, so up
Oh,
until
I see.
Tuesday the 15th, we're in Capricorn, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 16th, we move into Aquarius. Okay. And then the moon, you can see, moves much quicker. So on the 1st, it's in Capricorn, and at 2 in the morning on the 2nd, it moved into Aquarius, and it's there only for 2 days, 2.5, and then at midday at 1 o'clock, the moon moves into Pisces, and you can see it's in a short time in Aquarius because that's a small constellation, and it's in more days in Pisces because the Fishes is a big constellation. Okay, and on the 6th, the moon moves into Aries, which is another small constellation, and on the 8th, at 17 o'clock, it moves into Taurus, which is a big one. Okay, so then you can see why, because Capricorn is an Earth constellation, it says root on the part that says AM and PM. I do you the favor of interpreting it for you so that you know what part of the plant. So if you were planting carrots or beets, you would look and you would find a time when it said root, and that's when you would sow your seeds for that. And that would, and whereas flowers, you know, if you're planting ornamental flowers, you're not so interested that they have very established roots. You want them to have beautiful flowers, so that's what you would do there. And if you have lettuce or spinach, you would plant your leafy crops when it says leaf. And fruit is when you have like tomatoes, string beans, cucumbers, anything with squash, where you want the fruit. All right. So that is the first 2 columns. Do you get it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, I've included in this calendar 5 different lunar rhythms. There may be others, but I think that's enough for us. In fact, I even think it's one too many, but there's the, that it's called running high and running low. Like that is running high, and like that is running low. And I'm not going to explain to you what that does agriculturally because I've never met anybody except Maria Toon who says it has any significance. It just, but what it does, you can always find that running high is when the arc of the moon is up in Twins or Taurus. It's at the height, you know, where when the sun is at its height in the summer, it's in Twins or Taurus. And when it's at its lowest arc, it's in Sagittarius. So that's what that relates to, but we're not going to give it any more time. The next one is apogee and perigee. Does anybody know what that means?
Distance to the Earth.
That's right. So apogee, this is a great, I'll tell you a little story. In the early days, I started making this calendar before there were computers in everybody's home, right? So I had the most tedious way of doing it. That I got a high school teacher to create a formula because all my data was every 12 hours where the moon was. Anyway, you don't need to know all that. But I figured there's got to be some easier way because I knew that the distance of the constellation was always the same. It was the same number of degrees. So there must be some way where I can use that to repeat a pattern, but it didn't work. And I thought I had discovered what I called avocado's law. And that is because you can see why I called it avocado's law. It's the Earth, and this is the moon at perigee, and this is the moon at apogee. Now I've exaggerated it because the ellipse of the orbit of the moon is not as extreme as that. Nevertheless, it doesn't have a circular motion. It has, all of them have an elliptical path. And so, the reason why my shortcut didn't work is that when the moon is here at perigee, it goes faster. And when it's out here, it goes slower. So you have to calculate it every single time to make it. But it turns out that Kepler figured this out before me, and it's Kepler's second or third law. But it's still, it was fun to discover it. And so when it's perigee, you can see that the moon is closer to the Earth and the lunar influence is stronger. So Maria Thun experimented with that and found out that if you sow seeds at perigee, it's going to have more of a watery influence because the moon has to do with water and rainfall and fungus and all those watery diseases that you don't want in your garden. So, yeah.
Sorry, to zoom out for half a second. When is the more watery?
Perigee. That's when the lunar influence is too strong. Apogee, on the other hand, is when things tend to bolt because the moon is drawing them out. So you don't want to plant anything at perigee. And that's why I gray it out for 12 hours before and 12 hours afterwards. So here we go. On the 26th of February, perigee is at 17 o'clock. That's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then you can see that I grayed out 12 hours before and 12 hours afterwards so that you wouldn't dare plant anything during that time. It doesn't matter what it is, it'll tend to be more prone to the watery kinds of pests, mold and things. For apogee, if you're growing flowers, it doesn't really matter. Or if you're growing tomatoes or string beans, it doesn't matter. But if you're growing spinach, and apogee comes just because it's a different rhythm. It crosses the moon in the zodiac, which is very regular. So apogee here on the 10th, it's right in a root time. So you don't want your roots to go up to seed. You don't want the radishes to bolt. So I put a little bracket and I write flower in there so that you know that just during those hours, don't plant your roots, but you could do flowers if you wanted to. All right, I wanted to say that another lunar rhythm, so I do the interpretation for you, just to make it easier for people. So on the 9th, you see that funny horseshoe thing with the little circles at the bottom? That is the sign for the ascending node. This is another lunar rhythm where all of the planets go along the ecliptic, the plane of the sun's orbit, at a slight angle. So they're not identical on the ecliptic, but, so if that's the ecliptic, then the moon cuts it at 5 degrees above and 5 degrees below. So it's doing its thing like that, and when it's crossing the plane of the ecliptic going north, it's the ascending node. And when it's crossing it down, it's the descending node. Both of those are times when it's better not to plant, because it's just crossed influences. That's where you can also get, if the actual planet is there, then you can have an eclipse. I mean, but, and there I do 12 hours before and 12 hours after. I once tried growing tomatoes during an eclipse just for fun. I was shocked. I did it in the greenhouse, and the plant grew up and down and up like a sink drain. It was bizarre. And then it grew out of it, but I just thought, ooh, I can see why she just said don't do it.
What happens on the 18th that we're not supposed to grow?
Ah, that's the Mercury in a descending node. Thank you for asking. So sometimes Mercury or Venus, which are the two planets closest to the Earth, are in an ascending node or a descending node, and then we have to avoid that too. And I do it for 12 hours before and 12 hours afterwards.
Does this, do the nodes also have a progression?
Yes,
Okay.
the moon node takes
Precession.
18 years and 7 months, I think,
To move a degree.
to move, no, to come back to the same
I see.
place. So there's an axis of the moon node, the ascending and descending, and it gradually just goes around. So it maybe it's, I forget, it's probably in my calendar, but it's something like 18.7.
Does that path have a name? Like the sun has the ecliptic, does the moon's path have a name?
The sun, that's the, wait,
So the ecliptic is the path that the sun travels, right?
right?
Does that plane, does the moon's have one, like that angle? Because you use an angle as well. Is that-
Yeah, I just know that it's 5 degrees from the ecliptic. I don't know if it has a name, except the orbit of the moon,
Okay.
the plane of the orbit of the moon. So, next we have the phases, and I would just like to say that the other 50% of biodynamic farmers who didn't go for Maria Toon's calendar were probably all very satisfied with their work in relation to the phases of the moon. And when I learned from a master gardener in California, that's what we learned, was to sow our seeds. If they were going to be above ground, we sowed on above ground crops, so leaves and fruits and flowers. You would sow as the moon was waxing. And if it was going to be a root crop, you sowed while it was waning in order that it could just take its time to root around there, and you didn't need to be convinced that they were alive, although there's terrible impatience in some of us. But if you sow seeds and the germination is, if you time it to be up at the full moon, it's amazing how you come in the morning. I'm sure you've had that experience where they're all just like standing like soldiers. The whole row is up. It's very thrilling.
Yeah.
But that's usually when it's the full moon, when they come up. when they come up in the dark of the moon, they straggle. You know, like you think, oh my God, the seed wasn't good, or something is the matter. There's just like a few, and then the next day there's a couple more, and that's what generally when it's coming up during the dark of the moon. So I just need to give you a couple of more practical things, and then I want to give you a little bit of meaning. So these little funny things, like you can see, this means conjunction. That means when two planets are in the same place along the ecliptic. It doesn't, because of the different angles, it may be that there's a conjunction and one is higher than the other, but they're at the same place on the ecliptic in terms of the degree, so it's still a conjunction. And an opposition is when they're 180 degrees from each other, they're opposite. That's a harmonious thing. And then the other thing is a trine. And when there are planets in trine and they're in the same element, I give that more value, because Maria Toon gives it more value, than just the moon in its regular passage through the zodiac. So that's why sometimes you'll see brackets and another kind of an inserted element, and that's because there's a trine. So, can you follow all these 5 lunar rhythms at the same time? No. You can't. And so, rather than being crazy about it, you pick the thing that you feel most related to, and you follow it. And you notice like with the elements, so that the most people that I know work with the 4 elements of the plant. But if you can't, because like sometimes your sister gets married, or there's a terrible storm on the day when you were going to plant something, and you need to get it in. I hate it when people write to me that they kept postponing it for weeks because it wasn't the right day. Please don't do that. That's bad karma for me. Just do it when it makes sense. But if you know that you've put something in the ground at the wrong time, try to compensate by cultivating, hoeing, at the right time. When you have the soil has a crust on it, it's just the same as when people are crusty. It's like if you think you know everything better than everybody else, you're not open to learning. But if you feel kind of like a little chaotic inside, you really notice what people say, and you start being more open. And that's what cultivation does. It opens the soil to the current influences. So that's what I would recommend if you have to plant something at the time that isn't ideal, that you cultivate on the good times. So why do I do this calendar? I do it partly because I was just so impressed by this experiment that I thought more people in the world need to know this. Because even Alan Chadwick, the master gardener I worked with in California, when he saw something wasn't doing well, he just obliterated it. And we did everything perfect in his garden. And if we had cared, dug the bed and carefully formed it and hand broadcast the plants, and when they came up and they didn't look good, he didn't know about perigee or, any of these nodes and things, or an eclipse. That wasn't on his radar, and so if something was the matter, he instantly saw that this was never gonna come to anything, and he made us take it away. He didn't want it in his garden. So I think that's a reason to have a calendar, to just avoid these adverse times and to enhance the part of the plant that you want. I think it really helps to organize your work so that you know in advance, oh, that would be a good day to sow the string beans. And then if I need a second succession, I can know when I'm gonna do it. And I know when I'm gonna hoe all the leaf crops and all the root crops, or what, it just kind of helps organize your work.
Shannon,
Yeah.
what is celery?
Leaf.
Leaf?
Mm-hmm. Leaf and stem.
Leaf, the stem goes with leaf?
Yeah. But the ultimate reason for me is that you're building a relation to the heavens. And that goes to a much different talk. But if you ask yourself, how is that really possible? That the moon going on its path, its orbit, which is so far away from those constellations, which, if you are thinking materialistically, are just random stars that from our vantage point we made a picture of. If you try to make this jive with your sort of scientific knowledge, it's not going to work. But it does work. So you have to have other concepts for the heavens and for yourself and for the plant kingdom and for the connections. And that's a whole nother thing. If we had a longer time, I would go into the evolution of the earth and the plant and the animal kingdoms and how the spiritual beings who created nature and us withdrew and left us in freedom and created offspring beings who would maintain the rhythms even though they had withdrawn in order for us to have freedom. I mean, it's a whole complex world of thoughts, but there has to be another way of thinking about this to make it make sense. So I think it's worthwhile, and that's why I have all these articles. Oh, I know, I brought this, a little book of coincidence. It is really worth just thumbing through it and looking at the geometry of the planet's movement. Unbelievable. So once you've looked at these images, you don't have to pour over the meaning part, but just once you see the images, you will be convinced that there's wisdom in the heavens and not just random coincidence. And if we see it in nature, there's wisdom and beauty all around us. And that, that we need to, that's part of what this calendar is about, is us finding our place and beginning to work in harmony rather than just at cross purposes, with the heavens that are part of us. So I think we'll leave it there.
Yeah.